For years, veteran Jack Tanner lived with the guilt of a failed mission that cost his brothers-in-arms their lives. The man he once trusted, Major William H. Crowder, had stolen funds, falsified reports, and built his own hero's legacy on their graves. But when Jack's loyal dog unearthed a hidden vault beneath a desert shack, the truth finally clawed its way to light. And just wait until you hear how this buried secret shattered a false legend and restored honor to the fallen. When Jack Tanner handed over a crumpled $100 bill for a property deed, the real estate clerk gave him a puzzled look, the kind that said, "You sure you want this?" But Jack just nodded, slid the yellowed paper into his jacket pocket, and walked out into the blazing Arizona sunlight. He wasn't after comfort or convenience. What he wanted was quiet. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly before him, a golden sea of heat and stillness. To most people it was a wasteland, nothing but dust, wind, and the occasional coyote's cry. To Jack, it looked like freedom. After years of restless nights and ghosts that followed him home from service, he needed somewhere the world couldn't reach him. The shack sat on the edge of a dry arroyo, leaning slightly to one side as if tired of standing. Its wooden boards were gray and splintered, the roof patched with tin and hope. The front porch creaked under his boots as he stepped up and looked around. No neighbors for miles. No traffic, no hum of power lines, no voices, just silence. And for the first time in years, Jack felt like he could breathe. "Just me, the sand, and you," he murmured, glancing down at Duke, his German shepherd. The dog's tongue lolled out as he wagged his tail, panting from the heat. Duke had been with him since the last deployment. Rescued from a base overseas, loyal to the bone. In the years since, they had become each other's shadow. Inside, the shack was smaller than it looked. One room, a rusted sink, and a cot that smelled of age and dust. Jack set down his duffel, wiped his brow, and smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was his. He patched a hole in the wall with an old plank, cleaned the windows, and by sunset, the shack looked almost livable. As darkness crept in, Jack sat on the porch with Duke at his feet, watching the horizon fade from red to violet. The desert night was colder than he remembered, and the stars came alive, bright, endless, silent. He thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was where peace began. But that night, something didn't sit right. Jack awoke around midnight to the sound of scratching, faint, irregular, like nails dragging beneath the floorboards. Duke's ears perked up immediately. The dog stood, stiff and alert, his gaze locked on the far corner of the room. Jack held his breath, listening. The sound came again, a soft rustle, then silence. He reached for his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the room, landing on the old planks by the back wall. Nothing moved. The air felt heavy, the kind that presses down on you, thick with unspoken things. "Probably rats," Jack whispered, forcing a chuckle. But Duke didn't relax. He stayed there for a long minute, tail raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The next morning, Jack examined the spot where Duke had stood guard. The floorboards there were darker, the wood swollen slightly, as though the desert beneath had shifted. He knelt down, ran a hand across the surface. Solid enough. Still, something about it tugged at the back of his mind. Over the next few days, Jack tried to settle in. He fixed the generator, cleared weeds, and even built a rough table from spare wood. But every night, the sounds returned, faint tapping, sometimes a distant clink, like metal brushing stone. Duke would always wake first, pacing restlessly, nose pressed to that same corner. Jack tried setting traps. Nothing. He poured sand into the cracks. Still the noises came. By the fifth night, the sound grew louder, sharper, a thump that jolted him awake. Duke barked once, low and urgent. This time it wasn't just sound. The floor moved just slightly, as if something beneath had stirred. Jack rose slowly, his pulse thudding in his ears. Duke stood near the wall, pawing at the boards, whining softly now. The dog's claws scraped against the wood, and for a brief second, Jack thought he saw a faint line of dust shift, like breath rising through the cracks. He crouched beside his companion, patting his neck. "Hey, what is it, boy?" Duke gave a quiet whine, then looked up at him with those sharp, knowing eyes before digging again, harder this time. Splinters flew. Jack reached to stop him, but hesitated. Beneath the boards, something metallic glimmered in the flashlight beam. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed again by dust. Jack blinked, unsure if his tired mind had played a trick on him, but Duke's steady growl said otherwise. That night, as the desert wind whispered through the cracks, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence he'd come here to find was gone, replaced by a question that wouldn't leave him. What was buried under his new home, and why did it feel like the past had followed him here? The first light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the wooden shutters, painting thin lines across the dusty floor. Jack Tanner was still half asleep when Duke's barking erupted, sharp, desperate, and louder than he'd ever heard it before. The dog wasn't just alerting, he was warning. Jack jolted upright, heart pounding, the sound echoing off the thin walls of the shack. He grabbed his flashlight and stumbled toward the noise. Duke was in the far corner of the room, the same place he'd been sniffing for days, his claws tearing at the boards. Splinters flew, dust rose in clouds, and the wood cracked under his strength. "Duke! Hey! Stop!" Jack shouted, kneeling beside him. But the dog didn't stop. His teeth were bared, his eyes locked on something beneath the floor. His body trembled with focus. Jack reached out to pull him back, and froze. Beneath the shredded planks, something metallic glinted in the flashlight's beam, a dull, rectangular outline, half buried under compacted sand. "What on earth?" Jack muttered, brushing the dirt away with his hand. The texture wasn't like any pipe or nail he'd seen. It was solid, cold, and heavy. The edges formed a perfect square. He stood and grabbed his crowbar from the workbench. The metal rasped against the floor as he pried at the edges. The wood splintered and gave way, revealing a small steel hatch, rusted around the bolts, but still intact. Jack's pulse quickened. He knelt again, the beam of the flashlight catching on something faintly engraved near the corner. A number, or maybe a code, long eroded by time. He wedged the crowbar under the lip of the hatch and leaned with all his strength. The hinges groaned in protest, shrieking as rust flaked off in curls. A final push, and it gave way with a deep, echoing clank. From the darkness below, a rush of cold air spilled out, thick, stale, and metallic. It smelled of oil and iron, and something older, like forgotten machinery. Duke stepped back, ears flattened, his growl now low and uneasy. Jack hesitated. The air felt wrong, unnaturally cool for the desert morning. Still, he lifted his flashlight and pointed it into the opening. The beam caught on metal walls, reinforced with rivets, and a short ladder leading down into a narrow chamber. Slowly, he descended. The metal rungs were cold beneath his hands. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of the desert faded away, replaced by a dense silence that seemed to press in on him. At the bottom, his boots met hard concrete. The space was no larger than a small storage room. Against the back wall stood several military-style crates, wrapped in faded tarps and sealed with rusted clasps. Faded stenciling still marked their surfaces, unit insignias, serial numbers, and dates from the late 1980s. Jack's breath hitched. His flashlight flicked from one crate to the next until it landed on a box smaller than the rest. Its lid wasn't locked. He brushed off the dust and lifted it carefully. Inside were stacks of old government bonds, yellowed letters sealed in wax, and several photographs bound with twine. He untied the bundle and held one photo up to the light. His stomach dropped. The image showed a man standing proudly in front of this very shack, his uniform crisp, a confident smile on his face. On the back, written in neat ink, Major William H. Crowder, Mojave Operations, 1987. Jack felt the ground tilt beneath him. He knew that name. Everyone in his unit did. Crowder had been their commanding officer overseas, a man respected, even idolized, for his leadership. He was the one who'd signed the reports after that final mission, the one that went wrong, the one Jack still saw in his dreams. Crowder was supposed to be a hero. He'd been honored, buried with ceremony, his name etched in marble. But what was his personal vault doing hidden under an abandoned shack? And why was it filled with government property and sealed letters no one had ever seen? Jack stared into the crates again, the beam trembling slightly in his hand. There were more boxes, more records, all marked with Crowder's name. Some contained old maps, others thick envelopes with coded stamps. The deeper he looked, the stronger the unease grew. He whispered, almost to himself, "What did you hide out here, sir?" The echo of his voice faded into the cold metal walls. Duke stood at the edge of the hatch above, watching, tail lowered, as if he too sensed that whatever lay beneath this shack wasn't meant to be found. Jack swallowed hard, staring at the dark corner of the vault where his flashlight beam ended. For the first time since moving to the desert, he didn't feel alone, and the thought chilled him more than the air ever could. He climbed back up, closing the hatch behind him, his mind racing. The shack creaked as the morning wind picked up, the desert sun beginning to rise. Yet to Jack, the day suddenly felt dimmer, as if something buried for decades had just stirred awake. For days, Jack Tanner barely slept. The vault had become both his obsession and his battlefield. What had started as curiosity had turned into something heavier, a slow, cold realization that everything he'd believed about the past was built on lies. Each box revealed more of the story. Each paper, each faded report, added another piece to the puzzle, and every piece darkened what he saw. He sat at the small desk he'd built from scrap wood, his flashlight flickering as he turned through oil-stained folders and water-warped documents. Some bore official seals, others were hand-signed with Crowder's name. At first, the language was coded: mission designations, financial routing, supply transfers. But Jack had lived that life. He knew the patterns, and when he began cross-referencing the dates with the missions he'd been on, the truth rose from the pages like a ghost. Crowder hadn't just mismanaged their mission, he'd rewritten it. The reports were forgeries, carefully crafted to shift blame away from command and onto the soldiers in the field. His soldiers. Jack recognized the names. His team, the ones who hadn't made it home. The report said they had disobeyed orders, that they'd lost contact. But Jack remembered that day too clearly. The failed extraction, the missing supplies, the way communications had gone dark right before the ambush. Now he knew why. Hidden among the reports were financial records, wire transfers routed through shell accounts tied to old supply contractors. The amounts were staggering, enough to fund entire covert operations off the books. And at the top of every authorization form was one name, typed neatly in black ink: Major William H. Crowder. Jack sat back, his breath shallow. For years he had carried the blame, believing his hesitation, his decisions, had cost lives. He'd lived with that shadow, the guilt that gnawed at him through sleepless nights. And now he saw it clearly for what it was: a burden that had never belonged to him. He looked at the photo again, Crowder smiling in front of the shack, sunlight glinting off his medals. The man had been honored, celebrated, given speeches and awards, while the men under him were remembered only as statistics. Jack felt something tighten inside. A pulse of rage he hadn't felt in years surged through him. His hand clenched into a fist, and before he could stop himself, he slammed it against the steel wall of the vault. The echo filled the room, deep and final. "You liar," he whispered through his teeth. "You let them die." Duke flinched at the sound, but stayed close, his eyes steady on Jack. The dog gave a low, uneasy whine, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. Jack exhaled, long and slow, forcing the anger down before it consumed him. For a fleeting moment he wanted to bury it all again, to close the hatch, lock the vault, and walk away. Let the desert take back its secrets. But that wasn't who he was, not anymore. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about truth. He gathered everything he could find: the mission reports, the forged signatures, the letters Crowder had written to his superiors. He worked through the nights, scanning, labeling, documenting every file. Duke stayed near his feet, silent and patient, as if sensing the gravity of what his owner was uncovering. By the fifth day, Jack had assembled enough evidence to shake the foundations of the story the public had believed for decades. He encrypted the files, sent them to journalists, veterans groups, and legal archives. Anonymous, careful, impossible to trace back to him. Then he waited. When the story broke, it didn't trickle out. It erupted. Headlines spread like wildfire across the country. Decorated hero Major Crowder linked to decades-old military fraud scandal. Old interviews resurfaced. Speeches were re-examined. Families of fallen soldiers came forward, demanding answers. The truth was no longer buried under sand and steel. It was on every screen, every front page. Jack watched it unfold in silence. The medals came down, the plaques were removed, official statements poured out, each one colder than the last. And though it didn't erase the years he'd spent haunted by guilt, something inside him finally began to shift. The weight that had sat on his chest, the invisible burden he'd carried since the war, started to lift. He walked outside that evening, the desert stretching endless before him. The wind moved softly through the dunes, carrying a faint scent of rain. Duke stood beside him, calm and still. Jack looked out toward the horizon, his jaw tight, eyes unblinking. He didn't feel victorious, he just felt lighter. The truth was out, and though it had come far too late for many, it had come at last. In the silence of the Mojave, beneath the fading light, Jack Tanner finally allowed himself to breathe. Weeks passed, and the desert began to feel like a different place. The same wind that used to sigh through the broken panels of the shack now carried a softer sound, as if even the Mojave had decided to rest. Jack Tanner could sense it. The air wasn't as heavy anymore, the nights weren't as long, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. He sat on the front porch one morning, the boards creaking under his boots, a chipped mug of coffee warming his hands. The horizon shimmered with heat, painting the sand in gold and amber. Duke chased the little spirals of dust that rose and twisted in the distance, barking once, then stopping to listen, his ears perked to every whisper of the wind. Jack smiled faintly. "Go on, boy. Catch one this time." The dog wagged his tail, tongue lolling, before bounding off again. The shack still leaked when it rained. The generator still sputtered when the nights got cold. His bank account hadn't changed, and the mailbox remained mostly empty. But inside him, where the old guilt used to live, there was space now. Quiet space. He hadn't felt that in a long time. Some nights he'd walk out past the dunes, flashlight off, just letting the stars guide him. The desert sky seemed endless, spilling with constellations so sharp they looked close enough to touch. He'd stand there for hours, breathing, letting the cold night wind brush against his face. The memories still came, but they didn't tear through him anymore. They passed, like echoes, distant, softened by time and truth. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived. No return address, just his name, written neatly in blue ink. Inside was a folded note, a short message from one of the reporters who had covered the Crowder story. "If you hadn't found that vault, the truth would have died with him. You gave closure to men who never got it." Jack read it twice, then set it down on the table beside his coffee mug. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning, and stared out toward the horizon. "Guess we did good, huh, Duke?" he said quietly. The shepherd looked up from his spot in the shade, tail thumping once against the ground. It was the kind of answer Jack had come to understand without words. He thought of his old team, faces he hadn't seen in over a decade, names that had lived on plaques and folded flags. Somewhere, their families finally knew what had really happened. The truth couldn't bring them back, but at least their stories were whole now. That mattered. The desert sun began its slow descent, staining the world in orange and copper. Shadows stretched long across the sand. The shack, once a lonely refuge, a place to hide, now looked almost welcoming. The boards he'd nailed, the walls he'd patched, even the cracks in the windows all seemed to belong there, like scars that no longer hurt. Duke trotted back to the porch and sat beside him, panting softly. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ear. The dog leaned in, pressing his head against Jack's leg, the way he always did when the world felt right. For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind carried a faint hum across the valley, the sound of the earth settling as the heat bled away. In the distance, a lone hawk circled, its cry sharp and pure. Jack exhaled slowly. The vault beneath him, sealed once again, no longer felt like a curse. It was part of the land now, a buried reminder of how close darkness and truth could sit together, waiting to be found. Above it all, the sky stretched open, wide and forgiving. He took another sip of coffee, now gone lukewarm, and watched the last of the daylight fade into deep violet. The desert that had once felt like exile now looked like freedom, vast, endless, and alive with quiet promise. And as Duke settled at his feet, tail brushing the porch boards, Jack Tanner finally understood something simple and profound. Sometimes peace doesn't come from running away from the past. It comes from facing it and then learning how to live again beneath the same sky.